The day Clara Sutton first touched a rabid dog without getting bitten was the day the miners started calling her a witch, though she preferred to think of herself as someone who simply listened better than most. She had arrived in Tonopah Junction, Nevada, in the spring of 1883 with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a letter from her deceased aunt, inheriting a small cabin on the outskirts of town where the desert stretched endlessly toward mountains that shimmered purple in the late afternoon heat. The dog had been frothing at the mouth, backing men against the saloon wall with its teeth bared and eyes wild with fear and sickness, and while Sheriff Donovan raised his rifle to put the animal down, Clara had walked straight through the gathering crowd and knelt in the dust. She did not speak, did not reach out immediately, but simply breathed slowly and let something inside her grow quiet and still until that stillness seemed to radiate outward like ripples on water. The dog had stopped snarling, its hackles lowering as it tilted its head, and then it had walked to her and laid its fevered head in her lap, where she stroked it gently until Doc Patterson could approach with his medical bag. The dog died an hour later, but it died peacefully, and Clara had washed her hands for a long time afterward, scrubbing its skin that never broke despite the animal's proximity to violence. Word spread quickly in a town where silver strikes and rattlesnake bites were the usual entertainment, and within a month, Clara found herself visited by ranchers and townspeople, bringing her every manner of distressed creature: a milk cow that had stopped producing after losing her calf, a barn cat that hissed and clawed at anyone who approached after being caught in a coyote trap, an injured hawk that a child had found with a broken wing, too frightened to let anyone splint it. Clara took them all into her small yard, where she had built simple enclosures from salvaged wood, and she worked her strange magic that was not magic at all, but something deeper, something that required her to empty herself of expectation and fear until she became a vessel of pure calm. The animals felt it, responded to it, and slowly they healed not just in body but in spirit. She was 22 years old, with honey-colored hair she kept in a practical braid, gray eyes that seemed to look through the surface of things, and a quiet manner that some mistook for shyness, but was actually intense observation. Her aunt's cabin was small but sturdy, with a pot-bellied stove that kept her warm during cold desert nights, and a porch where she sat in the evenings watching the sky turn colors that seemed impossible: oranges and purples, and reds that set the landscape on fire. She made a modest living, taking in sewing work and occasionally helping Doc Patterson when someone needed gentle hands during a difficult birth or surgery. But the animals were her true calling, the place where she felt most herself. Tonopah Junction was a town trying to decide what it wanted to be, caught between the lawlessness of a mining camp and the respectability of civilization. Silver had been discovered in the hills 3 years earlier, bringing a flood of prospectors and the businesses that followed them like pilot fish following sharks. The main street boasted 2 saloons, a general store, a boarding house, a livery stable, a blacksmith, and a small church that the circuit preacher visited twice a month. The buildings were raw wood that would take decades to weather into the silvered gray of older settlements, and dust coated everything despite the best efforts of shopkeepers who swept their boardwalks each morning. Beyond the town proper, ranches sprawled across the valley floor where hardy cattle grazed on bunch grass, and stubborn ranchers fought drought, rustlers, and the simple mathematics of trying to make a living in harsh country. It was late August when Yates Lawson rode into town leading a horse that was the color of midnight and just as full of mystery. Clara was in her garden, coaxing tomatoes from soil that required constant attention and precious water, when she heard the commotion on the main street, the sound of men shouting, hooves striking wood, and underneath it all, a high-pitched squeal of pure terror that went through her like a knife. She dropped her trowel and walked toward the noise, wiping dirt from her hands on her worn cotton skirt. The scene that greeted her was chaos barely contained. A magnificent black stallion reared and plunged at the end of a lead rope held by a tall cowboy who moved with the kind of fluid grace that suggested he had been born on horseback. The horse's eyes showed white all around, his nostrils flared red, and foam flew from his mouth as he fought against the restraint. Men had cleared the street, watching from doorways and behind water troughs, and the horse's iron shoes struck sparks against the stones someone had optimistically placed to create a proper road. Easy now, easy, the cowboy was saying, his voice low and steady despite the danger. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair that needed cutting and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years working outside. His eyes were an unusual shade of amber, almost gold in the bright sunlight, and his face had the kind of strong bones that would age well. He wore typical ranch clothes, denim pants, and a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled up over muscular forearms, a red bandana around his neck, and a battered Stetson that had seen better days. His boots were good quality, but well used, and he moved like a man who knew his business. "That horse is going to kill someone," Sheriff Donovan called from the safety of the saloon porch. "Yates, you should have shot him after he threw Jimmy." "I am not shooting him," Yates replied, and there was steel in his voice despite its quietness. "He is scared, not mean. There is a difference." The stallion reared again, and this time one of his hooves caught the hitching post in front of the general store, splintering the wood with a crack like a gunshot. The horse screamed again, that terrible sound of an animal pushed beyond endurance, and several women hurried their children inside. Clara found herself walking forward, that familiar stillness beginning to build inside her chest. "Miss Sutton, you best stay back," the sheriff warned, but Clara barely heard him. She was watching the horse, seeing past the violence to the terror underneath. Something had broken this animal's trust so thoroughly that he saw threats in every shadow, expected pain from every hand. Her heart ached with recognition because she understood what it meant to build walls so high that nothing could get in, not even comfort. Yates Lawson noticed her approaching, and his eyes widened. "Madam, please, Diablo is not safe right now." "Diablo," Clara said softly, still moving forward. "You named him Devil. He earned it." Yates kept the rope steady, letting the horse have some slack while maintaining enough tension to prevent a full bolt. "But I do not believe names have to be destiny." Clara liked that answer. She came to stand beside Yates, close enough that she could smell horse sweat and leather, and something else, a clean scent like sage and sun-warmed skin that seemed to belong to the man himself. "Tell me what happened to him." Yates glanced at her, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, a small scar through his left eyebrow. Previous owner used spurs and a whip. Jimmy, my ranch hand, found him half-starved in a box canyon up north, clearly escaped from whoever owned him before. We brought him back to the ranch, got him healthy, but he will not let anyone ride him. 2 weeks ago, he threw Jimmy and broke his arm. Some of the men want me to sell him to the knacker, but I heard about you. Heard you could calm animals that nobody else could touch. "I do not work miracles," Clara said, though she was already feeling that pull, that sense of connection beginning to form between her awareness and the horse's fractured consciousness. "But I will try." She took a step toward Diablo, and the horse's head swung toward her, ears flat against his skull. His muscles were taut as drawn wire, trembling with the urge to flee or fight. Clara stopped, planting her feet in the dust, and began to breathe. Slowly in through her nose, slowly out through her mouth. Finding her center, that place of absolute stillness that lived somewhere beneath thought and emotion. She had discovered it by accident years ago after her parents died in a typhoid outbreak, when grief had threatened to tear her apart, and the only way to survive was to find a place inside herself that grief could not touch. The stillness had saved her then, and she had learned to cultivate it, to sink into it like sinking into cool water on a hot day. The quality of the air seemed to change. The watching men fell silent. Even the wind that constantly swept through the valley seemed to pause. Clara breathed and felt herself becoming empty, becoming a space that could be filled with understanding rather than fear. She did not look directly at the horse, but rather let her gaze soften, seeing him in her peripheral vision. Predators stared. Prey looked away. She made herself prey, harmless, beneath notice. Diablo's ears flicked forward, then back, then forward again. His nostrils flared as he scented her, trying to determine what she was. His weight shifted from hoof to hoof, ready to explode into motion, but Clara did not move. She simply stood and breathed, and was still. Minutes passed. The sun beat down on Clara's head and shoulders. Sweat trickled down her spine. Her legs began to ache from standing motionless, but she did not waver. She had learned patience from watching animals, learned that humans rushed everything, tried to force outcomes instead of allowing them to unfold naturally. The horse needed time to realize she was not a threat, needed to make the decision to trust on his own terms. Finally, slowly, Diablo took a step toward her. Then another. His head was still high, his body still tense, but he was approaching rather than fleeing. Clara felt Yates tense beside her and sensed him wanting to say something, to warn her, but he remained silent, and she was grateful for it. The horse came close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the scars that crisscrossed his flanks and shoulders, evidence of the whip Yates had mentioned. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, anger flaring hot and bright before she breathed it away. Anger would not help now. Diablo stretched his neck out, muzzle extended toward her face. She could see the delicate hairs around his nostrils, the depth of his dark eyes. He blew out a breath that stirred the loose tendrils of hair around her face, and she breathed in the scent of him, horse and dust and something wild. Slowly, moving with infinite care, she raised one hand and held it out palm up, not reaching for him, but offering. The horse considered her hand for a long moment. Then he lowered his head and pressed his muzzle into her palm. Clara heard someone in the watching crowd let out a breath they had been holding. She kept her own breathing steady, fought the urge to smile or move or do anything that might break the fragile connection being forged. With her other hand, moving just as slowly, she reached up and placed her palm flat against the horse's neck. His skin was velvet over muscle, hot and alive. She could feel his pulse racing, could feel the tension that still vibrated through him, but he did not pull away. "Good boy," she whispered, pouring all her conviction into the words. "Good, brave boy." She stood there with her hands on the horse, breathing with him, letting her calmness flow into him like water flowing downhill. It was not a science, this thing she did. She could not explain the mechanism of it. But she felt the moment when something inside the horse began to unlock, when his breathing deepened and his muscles started to uncoil. The change was subtle but unmistakable, like watching ice begin to melt at the edge of a winter river. "I will be damned," someone said softly, and Clara recognized the voice of Thomas Werner, who ran the livery stable. "She is doing it." Clara ignored the spectators, focusing entirely on the horse. She ran her hand slowly up his neck to behind his ears, scratching gently. Diablo lowered his head further, leaning into the touch, and Clara felt something in her own chest ease. This was why she did it, this moment of connection across the vast gulf between species, the reminder that gentleness could reach places that force never could. "Can you lead him to my place?" she asked Yates without looking away from the horse. "Yes, madam." Yates's voice had a quality she could not quite identify, something between awe and relief, and perhaps something else. "If you think you can help him." "I will need time," Clara said. "Weeks, maybe longer, and I cannot promise anything. Some damage goes too deep to fully heal." "I understand." Yates shifted his grip on the lead rope. "Whatever you need, Miss Sutton. Time, money for feed, anything." Clara finally looked at him and found those unusual amber eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made something flutter low in her stomach. She told herself it was just the stress of the moment, the aftermath of adrenaline, but she was not entirely convinced. "I do not charge money for this, but if you could help repair the fence on my north paddock, that would be useful." A slow smile spread across Yates Lawson's face, transforming it from merely handsome to something that made Clara's breath catch. "I can do that, madam. Be happy to." They walked together through the town, Clara keeping her hand on Diablo's neck, Yates on the other side with the lead rope loose and easy. The horse walked between them, still nervous, his hooves striking the ground in a staccato rhythm that spoke of readiness to bolt, but he did not fight. People watched from windows and doorways, and Clara knew that by evening the story would have spread to every ranch and mining camp within 50 miles. The woman who could gentle wild things, the horse that was too dangerous to handle. She tried not to think about the expectations being built, the pressure of other people's hopes. She would do what she could for this damaged animal, and that would have to be enough. Her cabin sat at the end of a dirt track that wound away from the main road, surrounded by struggling cottonwood trees she watered religiously, and the paddocks she had built to house her various patients. Currently, she was caring for a three-legged dog that had lost a fight with a wagon wheel, two barn cats recovering from malnutrition, and a young coyote that someone had shot and then felt guilty about when they realized it was barely more than a pup. The coyote would return to the wild once he healed. The cats had already claimed her porch as their territory. The dog followed her everywhere, hopping along on three legs with boundless enthusiasm. The north paddock was indeed in poor repair, several rails hanging loose, and the gate dragging in the dirt. Clara had been meaning to fix it herself, but lacked the strength to lift some of the heavier timbers. She led Diablo to the largest enclosure, one that adjoined a three-sided shelter she had built the previous fall. There was water in a clean trough, hay in a manger, and plenty of space for a horse to move around without feeling confined. "This should work," Yates said, examining the setup with an approving eye. "He will be comfortable here." They managed to get Diablo into the paddock without incident, and Clara slipped the halter off carefully before stepping back through the gate. The horse immediately moved to the far corner, putting as much distance between himself and the humans as possible. But he did not try to jump the fence or batter himself against the rails. Small victories. Yates coiled the lead rope with practiced ease, his hands quick and efficient. "When should I come back? To work on that fence, I mean." "Whenever you have time," Clara said, suddenly aware that they were standing very close together in the shade of her porch, that she was dusty and sweaty and probably looked like she had been dragged behind a wagon. "I am usually here. I do not go into town much. Tomorrow, then, if that suits you. I could come in the morning, get it done before the heat of the day." Yates settled his hat more firmly on his head, and Clara noticed that his hands were scarred across the knuckles, marked by the 1,000 small injuries that came with ranch work. "And I would like to check on Diablo, if you do not mind. I have been trying to help him for 2 months now. I feel responsible." "Of course," Clara said. "He is still your horse." "Well, now, I am not so sure about that." Yates glanced at the paddock where Diablo stood watching them, head high and alert. "I think he might be deciding who he belongs to, and it might not be me." There was something in the way he said it, a weight beneath the words that made Clara look at him more closely. She saw weariness in the set of his shoulders, a kind of lonely determination in the line of his jaw. This was a man who took his responsibilities seriously, who did not give up on lost causes, who measured himself by standards that were probably too high. She recognized the type because she saw a similar face in the mirror every morning. "I will see you tomorrow then, Mr. Lawson," she said, offering her hand in a gesture that felt both too formal and necessary, a way of establishing that this was a business arrangement and nothing more. His hand engulfed hers, warm and calloused and strong. "Yates, please. We are going to be seeing quite a bit of each other if that fence is as bad as it looks." "Clara, then." She pulled her hand back, ignored the tingling in her palm that surely was just from the rough texture of his skin. "And the fence is worse than it looks, I am afraid." He laughed, a sound like water over stones, easy and genuine. "Of course it is. I will bring extra timber." She watched him swing up onto a bay mare that had been waiting patiently at the hitching post, moving with the unconscious grace of someone who had been riding since before they could walk. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell, and then he was riding back toward town, dust rising from the mare's hooves to hang golden in the late afternoon sun. Clara stood on her porch for a long moment, listening to the sound of hoofbeats fade into distance. The three-legged dog limped over to lean against her leg, and she scratched behind his ears absently. Already she was thinking about Diablo, planning her approach, considering what the horse would need. But underneath that professional consideration was something else, a humming awareness that she tried to dismiss as unimportant. It was not the first time a man had looked at her with interest, and she had always managed to deflect such attention politely but firmly. She had her work, her animals, her hard-won solitude. Romance was for women who could afford vulnerability, and Clara had learned years ago that vulnerability was a luxury she could not afford. Still, as she went about her evening chores, filling water troughs and checking on her various patients, she found her mind wandering back to amber eyes and a crooked smile, to strong hands that could be gentle, to a man who would not give up on a broken horse. She told herself it meant nothing, that he would fix her fence and take his horse back, and that would be the end of it. But some part of her, the part that understood animals better than people, recognized a connection forming whether she wanted it or not. That night she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the desert, the yip of coyotes and the rustle of nocturnal creatures, and thought about second chances and damaged things and whether healing was ever really possible. She thought about a horse that had been hurt so badly he trusted nothing, and about a cowboy who refused to give up, and about herself standing between them like a bridge built of patience and breath. She thought about tomorrow and the days that would come after, and she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest that might have been hope or might have been fear or might have been both at once. Sleep came slowly, and her dreams were full of running horses and open sky, and a voice saying her name like it was something precious. Yates arrived at dawn, riding the same bay mare and leading a mule loaded with fresh-cut timber and tools. Clara was already up, had been for hours, unable to sleep past the first light. She had checked on Diablo 3 times during the night, finding him standing alert in his paddock, and once at sunrise she had seen him drinking from the water trough, which she took as a good sign. Horses that were too stressed would sometimes refuse water, and dehydration could become dangerous quickly in the Nevada desert. She had coffee brewing when Yates knocked on her doorframe, too polite to simply walk into her yard unannounced despite the early hour. She poured him a cup, noting the way his face lit up at the smell, and they stood on the porch together, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of rose and gold. "This is good coffee," Yates said after his first sip. "Most cow camp coffee, you could use it to strip paint." "My aunt believed that life was too short for bad coffee," Clara replied. "She left me her recipe, along with the cabin, eggshells in the grounds to cut the bitterness." "Smart woman." Yates took another drink, then set the cup on the porch rail with obvious reluctance. "I should get started on that fence before the day heats up." Clara wanted to tell him to finish his coffee, that the fence could wait, but she recognized the statement for what it was. A man who was used to hard work and felt uncomfortable standing idle. "I will be working with Diablo if you need anything." She left him measuring and sawing, the sound of his work a companionable backdrop as she approached the paddock. Diablo was in the far corner again, but his head came up as she approached and his ears swiveled forward. Good. He was alert to her presence, but not panicking. She climbed up to sit on the top rail of the fence, finding a position where she could be close without invading his space, and then she simply sat. The morning stretched out, measured in sunlight and shadow. Clara sat on the fence and watched the horse, not staring directly, but keeping him in her awareness. Behind her, she could hear Yates working, the solid thunk of hammer on nails, the rasp of saw through wood. He did not try to talk to her or interrupt her concentration, and she was grateful for his understanding. Some people could not tolerate silence, felt compelled to fill every moment with noise. Yates Lawson, it seemed, was comfortable with quiet. Around mid-morning, Diablo took his first tentative steps toward her, not coming close, just moving from his corner to investigate the hay she had put out. But it meant he was relaxing, beginning to accept his environment as safe. Clara remained motionless, her body loose and unthreatening, while the horse ate. She noticed things about him that the chaos of yesterday had obscured: the elegant arch of his neck, the intelligence in his eyes, the way he moved with a fluid power that suggested he could run like the wind if given the chance. He was probably 3 or 4 years old, just coming into his full strength, and with proper handling, he would be magnificent. "He is looking better already," Yates said quietly, and Clara startled slightly. She had been so focused on the horse that she had not heard him approach. He stood a few feet away, leaning against a post with his hat pushed back and sweat darkening his shirt. "You have a gift, Clara." She felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. "I just pay attention. Most people are too busy, too rushed. Animals need time." "Maybe." Yates tilted his head, studying her with those disconcerting amber eyes. "But I have been paying attention to Diablo for 2 months, and he never once came near me the way he did you yesterday. That is more than just time." Clara did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. After a moment, Yates smiled slightly and pushed away from the post. "I fixed the worst of the fence. The gate needs new hinges, though, and I did not bring the right hardware. I will have to come back tomorrow with supplies from town." "You do not have to," Clara said quickly. "I can manage with what is there." "I know you can," Yates replied. "But I started the job, and I finish what I start. Besides, I want to see how Diablo progresses." He left before she could argue further, but not before catching her gaze and holding it for a moment that stretched just a beat too long to be purely professional. Clara watched him right away and told herself that the flutter in her stomach was just hunger, that she had forgotten to eat breakfast in her hurry to check on the horse. She was lying to herself, and she knew it. The days developed a pattern. Yates would arrive in the morning, work on various projects around her property that had needed attention for months, check on Diablo's progress, and then leave before the afternoon heat became oppressive. Clara spent hours with the horse, gradually moving from sitting on the fence to sitting in the paddock, then to standing nearby while he ate, then to approaching him directly. Diablo's trust built slowly, like a house constructed one careful board at a time, but it did build. By the end of the first week, he would take apple slices from her hand. By the end of the second week, he followed her around the paddock like an oversized dog, nickering softly when she arrived each morning. And all the while, Clara found herself increasingly aware of Yates Lawson, the way he moved, all lean muscle and unconscious confidence, the way he spoke to his mare, gentle words in a low voice that made something in Clara's chest ache, the way he sometimes caught her watching him and smiled, not smug or knowing, but pleased, like she had given him a gift. They talked while he worked, conversations that ranged from practical matters, like the best way to keep a garden alive in desert conditions, to more personal topics, like where they had come from and what had brought them to Nevada. Yates, she learned, was from Texas originally. His father had been a cowhand, his mother a school teacher, and they had died within a year of each other when Yates was 19. He had drifted west, working ranches from Oklahoma to Arizona, until he saved enough to buy his own spread just outside Tonopah Junction. The ranch was small, only a few hundred acres with a modest herd, but it was his, and he was proud of it, in a quiet way that Clara respected. He had 2 hands working for him: Jimmy, who was recovering from his broken arm, and an older man named Pete, who had forgotten more about cattle than most men would ever know. Clara told him about her own past in smaller pieces, like handing over fragments of broken pottery, her childhood in Illinois, the closeness of her family, the typhoid outbreak that took her parents and younger brother within a week when she was 17. The years afterward, living with various relatives who meant well but did not understand her need for solitude, for space to grieve. Her aunt's letter arriving like an answer to prayers she had not known she was praying, offering escape and independence in the form of a desert cabin 1,000 miles from everything she had known. "Do you miss it?" Yates asked one morning. while replacing the boards on her porch that had started to rot. Illinois, I mean. Trees and water and green things. Clara considered the question, watching Diablo graze peacefully in his paddock. Sometimes, especially in spring when everything would turn so green it almost hurt to look at, but I like it here. The desert has its own beauty. It does not try to be anything other than what it is. Yates looked up from his work, a nail held between his lips, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken. I know what you mean. There is an honesty to hard country. It does not make allowances, but it rewards patience, Clara added. Like Diablo. You could not force him to heal, but given time and space, he is finding his way back. Is that what you did? Yates asked softly. Found your way back? The question was gentle, but it landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward. Clara wrapped her arms around herself despite the growing heat. I am still working on it. Yates nodded slowly, drove the nail home with 3 precise strikes of his hammer. Seems to me you are doing just fine. It was a small exchange, hardly worth noting, but it settled into Clara's mind and stayed there. That night she lay in bed and thought about finding your way back, about whether healing was a destination or a journey, about whether it was possible to build something new without forgetting what had been lost. She thought about Yates's hands, scarred and capable. She thought about the way he looked at her sometimes, like she was a puzzle he wanted to understand. She thought about how long it had been since she let anyone close enough to matter. The 3-legged dog was sleeping at the foot of her bed, snoring softly. The cats were somewhere in the darkness, hunting or prowling or doing whatever cats did in the deep night. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the sky like someone had spilled diamonds on black velvet, more stars than she had ever seen in Illinois, where light and smoke obscured the heavens. Here in the desert, the universe revealed itself in all its terrible beauty, and Clara felt very small and very alive. 3 weeks after Yates brought Diablo to her, Clara decided the horse was ready to accept a saddle. She had been working up to it gradually, getting him comfortable with blankets draped across his back, with the weight of her arms around his neck, with having his hooves picked up and handled. He still startled at sudden movements, and probably always would, but the blind panic was gone. In its place was a wary trust, a willingness to try even when afraid. She mentioned her plan to Yates when he arrived that morning, carrying a new bucket she had mentioned needing. He set the bucket down carefully and frowned. Are you sure? 3 weeks seems fast for a horse as damaged as Diablo. I am not going to rush him, Clara assured. Just see how he responds to the saddle. If he is not ready, we will wait. Yates looked like he wanted to argue but settled for nodding. I would like to be there, in case anything goes wrong. I would like that too, Clara admitted. Having Yates nearby made her feel safer, though she was reluctant to examine why too closely. They approached the paddock together, Yates carrying his own saddle which he had brought from the ranch. It was well made but worn, the leather supple from years of use and careful maintenance. Clara opened the gate and they entered Diablo's space slowly, giving him time to see them coming. The horse looked up from his hay, ears forward, and walked over to greet Clara with his customary soft nicker. She scratched his favorite spot behind his left ear and felt him relax under her touch. Good boy, she murmured. We're going to try something new today, but you can tell me to stop anytime you need to. She took the saddle blanket from Yates and held it out for Diablo to smell. The horse snuffed at it, found nothing threatening, and allowed her to drape it across his back. So far, so good. Next came the saddle itself, and Clara felt Yates tense beside her as she lifted it into position. The saddle was heavier than she expected, and Yates's hands came up to help support the weight, his arms bracketing hers for a moment. Clara's breath caught at the unexpected closeness, the warmth of his body against her back, but she forced herself to focus on the horse. Diablo's muscles twitched as the saddle settled into place, and his head came up sharply. Clara dropped her hands from the saddle and stepped back, giving him space. Easy now, just a saddle. Nothing that is going to hurt you. The horse stood very still, every line of his body radiating tension. Clara could see the white showing around his eyes again, see his nostrils flare. Her heart sank, thinking she had pushed too hard, too fast, but then Diablo blew out a long breath, and his head lowered slightly. Not relaxed, but not panicking either. Considering. That is it, Yates said quietly. You are doing so good, boy. They stood together, the three of them, while the sun climbed higher and the temperature rose. Clara kept one hand on Diablo's neck, a steady point of contact, while Yates remained close enough to help if needed, but far enough back not to crowd. Minutes passed. A hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp and clear. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped. Finally, Clara reached for the cinch. Talk to him, she told Yates. Keep your voice calm. Yates began to speak, a low rambling monologue about nothing in particular. He talked about the weather, about the cattle moving to summer pasture, about a funny thing Pete had said over breakfast. His voice was like warm honey, soothing and sweet, and Clara found herself relaxing even as she worked. She drew the cinch tight slowly, giving Diablo every opportunity to object, but the horse stood firm. We did it, she breathed, stepping back to admire her work. The saddle sat perfectly on Diablo's back, and the horse stood wearing it like he had been born to it. I will be damned, Yates said, wonder clear in his voice. Clara, that is remarkable. She turned to smile at him and found him closer than she expected, close enough that she could see the flecks of green in his amber eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his sun-warmed skin. The moment stretched out, fragile and charged, and Clara felt her heart begin to hammer against her ribs. Clara, Yates said, his voice gone rough, I need to tell you something. But before he could continue, Diablo shifted his weight, and the saddle creaked, and the spell broke. Clara stepped back quickly, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. We should probably remove it soon. I do not want to overwhelm him on the first try. Yates nodded, something like disappointment flickering across his face before he masked it. Right, of course. They removed the saddle and made much of Diablo, feeding him carrots and apple slices and praising him extravagantly. The horse seemed pleased with himself, tossing his head and prancing slightly, and Clara laughed at his antics. But underneath the laughter was an awareness that something had shifted between her and Yates, that they were approaching a threshold neither of them had explicitly acknowledged. That evening, after Yates had left and Clara had finished her chores, she sat on the porch and watched the sunset. The dog was at her feet, the cats curled on either side of her, and beyond the paddock, Diablo stood at the fence line, looking toward the open desert. They were a collection of broken things, Clara thought, learning to fit together in new configurations. She thought about Yates's aborted confession, about the way her heart had raced when he stood close. She thought about the fact that she liked his presence around her home, looked forward to his morning arrivals, felt bereft on the Sundays when he stayed at the ranch to work there. These were dangerous thoughts for a woman who had built her life around independence and solitude, and yet she could not seem to stop thinking them. A month ago, she had been content with her animals and her work and her hard-won peace. Now she felt restless, aware of absences she had not noticed before. The cabin felt too quiet at night. Her table felt too large for one person. Her bed felt too empty. She was, she realized with something like dismay, falling in love. The realization should have terrified her, and part of it did. Love meant vulnerability, meant opening yourself to the possibility of devastating loss. Clara had lost so much already that the thought of risking more felt like volunteering to be broken all over again. But another part of her, the part that worked with frightened animals and understood that trust was the foundation of everything, whispered that maybe it was time to practice what she preached. Maybe it was time to take a risk. The next day was Sunday, and Clara expected not to see Yates. But mid-morning she heard hoofbeats and looked up from weeding her garden to see him riding toward her cabin. He was dressed differently than his work clothes, wearing a clean white shirt and a leather vest, his hat brushed free of dust. He looked nervous, and Clara felt her stomach flip over. "I hope I am not intruding," Yates said as he dismounted. "I know it is your day of rest." "You are not intruding," Clara assured him, aware that she was still wearing her oldest dress and had dirt under her fingernails. "Is something wrong with Diablo?" "No, nothing like that." Yates turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she was learning meant he was working up to something difficult. "I came to talk to you about something other than horses." Clara's heart began to race. "All right, Clara." He looked up, met her eyes directly. "I am not good with words. I am better with actions, with doing rather than saying. But you deserve words, deserve to hear this properly." "Hear what?" Clara's voice came out barely above a whisper. "That you have been on my mind since the day I first saw you walk up to Diablo without an ounce of fear. That I find myself looking for excuses to come here, fixing things that do not really need fixing just to be near you. That I think you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met, and I am hoping, maybe foolishly, that you might feel even a fraction of what I am feeling." Clara's breath caught in her chest. She had imagined this conversation in vague terms, but hearing it laid out so honestly, so vulnerably, made it real in a way that imagination could not match. "Yates, I do not know what to say." His face fell slightly and he nodded. "That is all right. I did not come expecting anything. I just needed you to know. Needed to be honest before I went mad from keeping it inside." "No," Clara said quickly, reaching out to catch his arm before he could turn away. "I mean, I do not know what to say because I am not used to talking about things like this. But if you are asking whether I feel something for you, then yes. Yes, I do." The transformation of his expression was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "You do?" "I like having you here," Clara said, the words coming faster now that she had started. "I look forward to your visits. I find myself thinking about you when I should be thinking about other things. And yesterday, in the paddock, when you stood close to me, I wanted to turn around and kiss you more than I have wanted anything in a very long time." Yates's eyes widened, and then he was smiling, that beautiful, unguarded smile that made him look younger and lighter. "Clara Sutton, may I court you properly? May I take you to dinner, take you riding, spend time with you that is not about horses or repairs or anything other than getting to know each other?" Clara felt a laugh bubble up in her chest, giddy and bright. "I would like that very much." He stepped closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek with a gentleness that belied his strength. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," Clara breathed, and then his mouth was on hers, and thinking became impossible. The kiss was sweet and searching, tender in a way that made tears prick behind Clara's closed eyes. Yates kissed like he did everything else, with complete focus and care, his lips warm and firm against hers. Clara's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling his heart hammer beneath her palms, and she kissed him back with all the longing she had been trying to deny. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the day I met you," he admitted. "You should have done it sooner," Clara said, then laughed at her own boldness. They spent the rest of that Sunday together, talking and laughing and stealing kisses like teenagers instead of adults well past 20. Yates told her about his dreams for the ranch, about wanting to build a real house instead of the line shack he currently lived in, about hoping to expand the herd and maybe add horses. Clara shared her thoughts about expanding her work with animals, maybe training others to use her methods, maybe writing about the techniques she had developed. They were dreams neither had voiced before, and speaking them aloud made them feel possible in a way they had not been in isolation. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Yates prepared to leave with obvious reluctance. I will be back tomorrow, he promised, stealing one more kiss on her porch. I will be waiting, Clara replied, and meant it with her whole heart. She watched him right away, then turned to find Diablo watching her from his paddock. The horse nickered softly, and Clara walked over to scratch his neck. What do you think? She asked. Am I making a fool of myself? Diablo just huffed and lipped at her sleeve, and Clara chose to take that as approval. The summer unfolded like a flower opening, warm and bright and full of promise. Yates courted Clara with a steadiness that soothed her lingering fears about vulnerability. He brought her wildflowers from the hills, taught her to shoot a rifle for protection against rattlesnakes and the occasional coyote that got too bold, helped her build additional paddocks for the steady stream of animals people brought her. Clara cooked him dinners that they ate on her porch while watching the spectacular desert sunsets, taught him some of her techniques for reading animal behavior, mended his shirts when they tore. They went riding together on Sundays, Yates on his bay mare and Clara on a gentle gelding that Thomas Werner loaned her from the livery. They explored the surrounding country, finding hidden springs and ancient rock formations and valleys where wildflowers bloomed in defiant splashes of color against the muted desert palette. Yates pointed out the landmarks that bordered his ranch, showed her the line shack where he lived, which was indeed barely more than a shed with a stove and a cot. Clara understood then why he spent so much time at her cabin, why he seemed to savor every moment in her company. He was lonely, she realized, had been lonely for a long time, and the recognition pierced her heart because she understood loneliness intimately. Diablo continued to progress. 6 weeks after his arrival, Clara rode him for the first time with Yates spotting her from the ground in case something went wrong. The horse accepted her weight with only a slight tremor, and when she asked him to walk forward, he did. Clara kept the first ride short, just around the paddock, but tears streamed down her face by the end of it. This horse that had been so broken, so terrified, was choosing to carry her, choosing to trust despite every reason not to. You did it, Yates called up to her, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Clara, you brought him all the way back. She dismounted and threw her arms around Yates's neck, suddenly overcome with emotion. He caught her easily, holding her close, and she buried her face in his shoulder. We did it, she corrected. You did not give up on him. That mattered. I had good help, Yates said, his arms tightening around her. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, I love you, Clara. Her breath caught. They had been dancing around the words for weeks, the feeling obvious in every action and glance. But hearing it spoken aloud changed something fundamental, made it real and solid and undeniable. I love you too, she whispered against his neck and felt him shudder. I think I have for a while now. They stood there in the paddock, holding each other, while Diablo grazed peacefully nearby, and Clara felt a sense of rightness settle into her bones. This was where she was supposed to be. This man was who she was supposed to be with. It was not logical or rational, but truth rarely was. That evening, after Yates had reluctantly returned to his ranch for evening chores, Clara sat down and wrote a letter to her cousin in Illinois. She had been maintaining sporadic correspondence over the years, dutiful updates that revealed little of her inner life, but now she found herself pouring out the story of the past 2 months. The frightened horse, the stubborn cowboy, the unexpected love that had grown between them. She wrote about the desert she had come to love, about the work that fulfilled her, about the possibility of a future she had not dared to imagine. Writing it down made it feel even more real, and she sealed the letter with a sense of completion. Fall came to the Nevada desert, bringing cooler nights and skies so clear they seemed to ring like crystal. The town of Tonopah Junction prepared for winter, stocking supplies and battening down for the season when travel became difficult. Yates began to mention the difficulty of the line shack during winter storms, how the wind came through the walls and the stove barely kept him warm. Clara understood what he was really asking, but they both danced around the direct question, aware that what he was proposing was scandalous by any measure. Finally, on a crisp October evening, when the first frost was painting the edges of everything silver, Yates took Clara's hands in his and spoke plainly. "Marry me," he said. "I know I do not have much to offer yet. The ranch is still small, and the house I want to build for you is still just plans in my head. But I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone, and I want to spend every day for the rest of my life proving that to you." Clara looked at this man who had brought her a broken horse and in the process allowed her to see her own broken places, who had been patient with her fears and celebrated her strengths, who looked at her like she was the answer to questions he had been asking his whole life. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." His whoop of joy sent the nearby horses skittering, and then he was spinning her around in the yard, laughing like a child. When he finally set her down, both of them dizzy and breathless, he pulled a ring from his vest pocket. It was simple, a silver band with a small turquoise stone, but Clara thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "It was my mother's," Yates said as he slid it onto her finger. "The only thing of hers I kept. I would be honored if you would wear it." "It is perfect," Clara said, watching the stone catch the last light of the setting sun. "You are perfect." "I am far from perfect," Yates corrected with a smile. "But I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Tonopah Junction, with half the town in attendance and the other half scandalized that they had not waited longer for a proper engagement. Clara wore a simple dress of pale blue that she had sewn herself, and Yates wore his best suit, which Pete had helped him press until every crease was sharp. Doc Patterson gave Clara away, and Thomas Werner stood as Yates's best man. The circuit preacher performed the ceremony with enthusiasm, clearly delighted to have a wedding to break up the usual routine of baptisms and funerals. Clara remembered little of the ceremony itself, too overwhelmed by the enormity of what she was doing. But she remembered the look in Yates's eyes as she walked down the aisle, remembered the steadiness of his voice as he spoke his vows, remembered the feeling of his lips on hers when the preacher pronounced them man and wife. She remembered the celebration afterward at the boarding house where Mrs. Chin had prepared a feast, remembered dancing with her new husband while someone played fiddle, remembered the joy on the faces of people who had become her community without her quite realizing it. They spent their wedding night at Clara's cabin, which was now their cabin, and discovered each other with a tenderness that brought tears to both their eyes. Yates was gentle and patient, taking his time despite his obvious desire, making sure Clara felt safe and cherished. And Clara, who had built walls so high around her heart, found herself tearing them down brick by brick until she stood vulnerable and open and utterly his. Afterwards, lying in the darkness with her head on Yates's chest and his arms wrapped around her, Clara felt a peace she had not known since before her family died. This was home, she realized. Not the cabin or the land or even the animals she loved. Home was this man's heartbeat under her ear, his breath in her hair, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her back. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked softly. "That I am happy," Clara said, the words simple but weighted with truth. "I did not think I would ever feel this way again, but I am so very happy." His arms tightened around her. "Good. That is all I ever want. To make you happy." "You do," Clara promised. "Every single day." Winter in the Nevada desert was harsh but beautiful, the landscape stripped down to essential elements of rock and sky and stubborn survival. Yates moved his few possessions into Clara's cabin and set about making improvements, insulating walls and fixing drafts and building furniture to replace her mismatched collection. They worked side by side, falling into rhythms of domesticity that felt both strange and utterly natural. Yates would wake before dawn to tend his cattle, riding out into the cold, while Clara milked the goat they had acquired and fed the chickens that now lived in a coop Yates had built. He would return for lunch, often bringing game he had shot which Clara would cook into hearty stews that could feed them for days. Evenings were spent by the fire, Yates carving or mending tack, while Clara sewed or read aloud from the books they borrowed from the town's small lending library. People still brought Clara animals, though the winter reduced the traffic. A dog that had been kicked by a mule, a cat with a broken leg, a young doe that hunters had accidentally orphaned. Clara worked her magic on each of them, and Yates helped, learning her techniques and developing his own instincts for animal behavior. He had a gift for it, Clara realized, a natural gentleness that his cowboy exterior concealed. Together, they made a formidable team. Diablo had become Yates's primary mount, the horse having bonded so thoroughly with both of them that he was now as steady as any ranch horse. The transformation was complete, from terrified wreck to trusted partner, and Yates often said it was like having a different animal entirely. Clara knew better. Diablo was not different. He had simply been given the space and time to become who he was meant to be all along. It was a lesson she applied to herself as well, recognizing that her own healing had required similar patience and faith. Spring returned, bringing with it the renewal of the land and news that shook their small corner of the world. Silver production in the Tonopah mines had increased dramatically, and outside investors were buying up claims and pouring money into the area. The town was growing, new buildings springing up like mushrooms after rain, and with growth came both opportunity and complication. Yates saw a chance to expand his herd, to buy additional land that was suddenly available, to build the life he had dreamed of. But it would require risk, require borrowing money, and trusting that the boom would continue. They discussed it over many evenings, weighing options and possibilities. Clara had some money saved from her aunt's estate, and she offered it without hesitation. "We are partners," she said firmly when Yates tried to refuse. "Your dreams are my dreams now." They bought another 200 acres adjoining Yates's existing ranch, land with good water and grass that could support a much larger herd. They hired 2 additional hands to help with the increased workload, and Yates began building the house he had promised Clara, laying foundation stones with his own hands and framing walls with help from Pete and the other men. Clara would ride out to watch the progress, imagining the rooms that would fill with their life together, the porch where they would sit in old age, the nursery that she secretly hoped would be needed sooner rather than later. She had not yet told Yates about her suspicions, wanting to be certain before raising hopes. But her monthly courses had not come for 2 cycles now, and in the mornings she felt a queasiness that had nothing to do with anything she had eaten. Doc Patterson confirmed it in early May, his weathered face creasing into a smile as he delivered the news. Clara was going to have a baby, due sometime in late December or early January. She rode home in a daze, one hand pressed to her still flat stomach, marvel and terror warring in her chest. She had always wanted children, but had assumed that ship had sailed when she lost her family and retreated into solitude. Now, impossibly, life was growing inside her, a child who would be part her and part Yates, who would grow up with the desert as their playground and animals as their companions. The thought was overwhelming in its beauty. Yates was working on the house when she arrived, shirtless in the afternoon heat, with sweat gleaming on his tanned skin. He looked up as she dismounted, his face lighting up the way it always did when he saw her, and Clara felt her heart overflow with love for this man who had given her so much. "I have news," she said, walking into his arms. "Good news, I hope, given that smile," Yates replied, pulling her close despite his sweaty state. "The best news." Clara leaned back to look up at him. "We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Yates just stared at her, as if the words needed time to travel from his ears to his brain. Then understanding crashed over his face like a wave, and he let out a shout that probably carried all the way to town. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing and whooping, before abruptly setting her down with exaggerated care. "Did I hurt you? Is spinning bad for the baby?" His hands hovered over her protectively, his face creased with sudden concern. Clara laughed, tears streaming down her face. "I am fine. The baby is fine. But I am going to need you to help me more with the heavy work now. Doc Patterson says I need to be careful." "I will do everything," Yates promised. "You will not lift a finger. I will hire someone to help you with the animals. I will cook and clean and carry you everywhere if that is what it takes. Yates! Clara cupped his face in her hands. I just need you to be here, to be you. That is all I need. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, pouring all his joy and love and promise into the connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed his hand to her stomach with a reverence that made Clara's throat tight. Thank you, he said quietly, for trusting me enough to build this life together, for taking a chance on a cowboy with more dreams than sense, for giving me everything I did not know I needed. Right back at you, Clara whispered. I love you, Yates Lawson. I love you, Clara Lawson. He grinned suddenly. That sounds good. My wife, mother of my child. They stood together in the half-built house, surrounded by raw lumber and possibility, and Clara felt the last of her old fears fall away. She had spent so long protecting herself from loss that she had nearly missed out on the greatest gift life could offer. Love was risk, yes, but it was also reward beyond measure, and she was done being afraid. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the long, hot summer. Clara's belly swelled, and Yates took to talking to the baby through her skin, telling outrageous stories and singing off key songs that made Clara laugh until she ached. The house was completed in September, a sturdy structure with 4 rooms and a real glass window in the parlor that Yates had ordered from San Francisco at considerable expense. They moved their belongings from the cabin, though they kept it maintained as a place to house animals that needed intensive care. The ranch prospered. Their herd grew healthy and fat on the good grass, and Yates sold calves in the fall for a price that made him stagger. With the profits, they bought furniture and supplies and hired another hand to help through the winter. Clara's reputation continued to grow, and people traveled from increasingly distant ranches to bring her their problem animals. She trained several local women in her techniques, sharing knowledge that had previously existed only in her instincts and experience, and took deep satisfaction in seeing them succeed. In late November, they hosted Thanksgiving dinner for their small crew of ranch hands and several of Clara's friends from town. The house filled with laughter and the smell of roasting turkey, and as Clara looked around the table at faces lit by candlelight, she marveled at how much her life had changed in less than 2 years. From solitary woman with walls around her heart to wife, soon-to-be mother, friend, teacher, Yates caught her eye across the table and winked, and she felt their child kick as if in agreement. The baby came on a cold January night when the stars were so bright they seemed to hang just beyond reach. Clara's labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when she questioned every choice that had brought her to this point, but Yates stayed beside her the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her face and telling her she was the strongest person he had ever known. Doc Patterson and Mrs. Chin, who served as midwife, worked efficiently between contractions, and just before dawn, Clara pushed her son into the world with a final effort that left her exhausted and triumphant. Yates cried when he held his son for the first time, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he counted tiny fingers and toes. He is perfect, he breathed. Clara, he is absolutely perfect. They named him Matthew, after Yates's father, and from the beginning he was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in manageable stretches. Yates proved to be a devoted father, changing diapers without complaint and walking the floor at night so Clara could rest. He built a cradle that rocked with the gentlest touch and carved toys that Matthew would not be able to use for months, but that seemed important to create anyway. The ranch continued to thrive, and by the time Matthew was 6 months old, they were discussing buying more land. Clara was back to working with animals, though she kept Matthew close in a sling while she worked with the gentler cases. The baby seemed to inherit her gift, falling asleep to the sounds of horses and dogs and whatever other creatures happened to be in residence. Diablo was particularly patient with the child, allowing himself to be grabbed and drooled on with remarkable tolerance. 2 years passed in a blur of work and love and small domestic moments that accumulated into a life. Matthew grew sturdy and curious, with his father's amber eyes and his mother's quiet observation skills. A daughter, Emma, arrived on a spring morning full of birdsong and new grass, and she proved to be more boisterous than her brother, demanding attention with lusty cries and rewarding it with brilliant smiles. The house that had seemed so large when they built it now felt perfectly sized, filled with the chaos and joy of young children. Yates built an addition anyway, rooms for the children to grow into, and a workroom for Clara where she could treat animals without worrying about little ones underfoot. The ranch expanded again, and they hired a foreman to manage the day-to-day operations, while Yates focused more on breeding stock and long-term planning. Money was no longer a constant worry, though they lived carefully, remembering harder times and wanting to be prepared for whatever the future might bring. Tonopah Junction grew into a proper town, with electric lights strung along Main Street and talk of a railroad spur that would connect them to the wider world. The mines continued to produce, though everyone knew that silver was finite and eventually the boom would end. But that was a problem for another day. For now, the town thrived, and Clara and Yates thrived with it. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Yates took Clara riding out to the place where they had gone on their first Sunday together. The desert was in bloom, a rare wet spring having coaxed flowers from every crack and crevice, and the landscape looked like something from a dream. They dismounted at a high point overlooking their ranch, the house visible as a small square of white against the tawny grass, and Yates pulled Clara back against his chest. 5 years, he mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. I know what you mean, Clara said, lacing her fingers through his. I cannot really remember what my life was like before you. I know I was lonely. I know I was just going through motions, but it seems distant now, like it happened to someone else. Are you happy? Yates asked. I know things did not turn out exactly how we planned. More children than we expected, less time for your animal work, all the complications that come with running a ranch and raising a family. Clara turned in his arms to face him. I am happier than I ever imagined possible. Yes, it is hard sometimes. Yes, I get tired and frustrated and wonder if I am doing anything right, but at the end of every day I get to lie down beside you, and that makes everything worthwhile. Yates kissed her, slow and sweet, and Clara felt the familiar heat begin to build low in her belly. Even after 5 years and 2 children, desire had not dimmed between them. If anything, it had deepened, become richer with the knowledge of shared history and commitment. I love you, Yates murmured against her lips. I love our life. I love our children. I love waking up every morning knowing I get to spend another day with you. I love you too, Clara replied. Thank you for being stubborn enough not to give up on a frightened horse. Thank you for bringing him to me. Thank you for being patient with a woman who had forgotten how to trust. Thank you for every single day we have had together. They stood there on the hilltop, holding each other while the desert bloomed around them in defiance of all logic and expectation. It was a fitting metaphor, Clara thought. They had both been desert landscapes, harsh and protective, and seemingly barren. But given the right conditions, given water and care and time, they had bloomed into something beautiful. Together they had created life in multiple senses, building a family and a home and a love that would outlast them both. The years continued to unfold, bringing the challenges and joys that come with any life fully lived. There were dry years when they worried about the cattle and carefully rationed water. There were good years when rain came at the right times and the herd multiplied. There were illnesses and injuries, setbacks and triumphs, moments of despair and moments of transcendent joy. Through it all, Clara and Yates remained anchored to each other, their love the foundation on which everything else was built. Matthew grew into a serious boy who loved books and numbers, already talking about becoming a veterinarian and combining his mother's gift with medical science. Emma was fearless and imaginative, more interested in riding horses than in dolls, declaring at age 5 that she was going to be a rancher like her father. A third child, another son named Thomas, after no one in particular, but because they liked the name, arrived when Clara was 30 and brought a sweetness to the family dynamic that everyone adored. Clara's work with animals became known far beyond Tonopah Junction. She published several articles in agricultural journals, and she began to receive letters from people across the West asking for advice. A few times she traveled to particularly difficult cases, always accompanied by Yates and the children, turning the trips into adventures that the kids talked about for months afterward. She never charged much money, just enough to cover expenses, because the work itself was the reward. Seeing a frightened animal learn to trust again, seeing the relief and gratitude on an owner's face, knowing that she had made a difference in that creature's life, that was worth more than gold. Yates built the ranch into one of the most successful operations in the region, known for quality cattle and ethical treatment of both animals and workers. He was elected to serve on the town council and later became mayor for a term, though he declined to run again, saying he preferred working with cattle to working with politicians. People respected him for his fairness and his word, which was as good as any contract. Diablo lived to be 23 years old, a remarkable age for a horse, and when he finally lay down in his paddock one spring morning and did not get up again, Clara and Yates sat with him until the end. Clara stroked his neck and whispered thanks for everything he had taught her, for being the bridge that brought her and Yates together, for trusting her when trust seemed impossible. Yates wept openly, this horse having been his companion through some of the hardest and best years of his life. They buried Diablo on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a marker that Yates carved himself. It read simply, Diablo. He was brave. Time moved forward as it always does, indifferent to human joy or sorrow. The children grew and left home, pursuing their own dreams. Matthew did indeed become a veterinarian, setting up practice in Reno and marrying a school teacher who shared his gentle nature. Emma shocked everyone by becoming a lawyer, fighting for animal welfare laws and women's rights with equal passion. Thomas took over the ranch, bringing new ideas and energy while respecting the foundation his parents had built. Clara and Yates grew old together, their hair turning silver, their faces weathering like the buildings in town, their movements slowing but their love never dimming. They sat together on the porch they had built 40 years earlier, watching sunsets that still took their breath away, counting grandchildren who ran through the house bringing chaos and laughter, remembering the journey that had brought them from loneliness to fullness. "Do you remember the day you brought me that terrified black horse?" Clara asked one evening. Her hand nestled in Yates's. "Every detail," Yates replied. "I was desperate, and I had heard about the woman who could calm animals. I did not expect her to calm me too." Clara laughed, the sound softer now, but still full of joy. "I did not expect a cowboy with stubborn determination and kind eyes. I did not expect to fall in love." "Best surprise of my life," Yates said, lifting her hand to kiss it. "Every single day with you has been a gift, Clara. Even the hard days. Especially the hard days, because we faced them together. I would not change anything," Clara said, and meant it absolutely. "Every moment led us here, to this porch, to this life, to each other. I am grateful for all of it." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, their first kiss, their wedding, the births of their children, every significant moment of their shared life. The desert stretched around them, eternal and enduring, and Clara felt at peace. She had come to Nevada, running from grief and loss, building walls to protect a heart too damaged to risk again. But love had found her anyway, in the form of a desperate cowboy and a frightened horse, and it had transformed her life in ways she never could have imagined. Her ability to calm frightened animals had been rare, a gift she had cultivated through pain and patience. The cowboy had brought her his most scared horse, hoping for a miracle. What neither of them knew then was that in healing the horse, they would heal each other. That in taking the risk to trust, to love, to build a life together, they would create something far more valuable than any silver strike or material success. They would create a love story that would outlast them both, a testament to the power of patience, faith, and the courage to open your heart even when every instinct screams to keep it closed. As Clara drifted off to sleep that night, held in the arms of the man who had been her partner for more than 40 years, she thought about all the frightened creatures she had helped over the decades: horses and dogs and cats and wild things, each one teaching her something about fear and trust and the possibility of healing. But the most important lesson had come from Diablo, the black stallion who had been so broken that no one thought he could be saved. He had taught her that no damage was too great, no fear too deep, no heart too guarded to respond to love given freely and patiently. He had been the catalyst for everything good in her life, and she would be forever grateful. Years later, when Clara and Yates were both gone and their children gathered to sort through a lifetime of accumulated possessions, they found a journal Clara had kept. In it were detailed accounts of every animal she had worked with, notes on techniques and observations, but also personal reflections on her life and marriage. The last entry, written just days before she died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, read simply: "A frightened horse brought me love. Love brought me healing. Healing brought me home. I have been blessed beyond measure, and I leave this world with no regrets and a heart full of gratitude." To anyone who reads this, remember, gentleness is not weakness, patience is not passivity, and love is always, always worth the risk. Matthew read those words aloud at his mother's funeral, his voice breaking on the last sentence. Emma held her father's hand as they stood beside the grave, Thomas supporting his father's other side. Yates wept quietly, mourning the woman who had been his everything, but also celebrating a life well lived and a love that had enriched everyone it touched. They buried Clara next to Diablo on the hill overlooking the ranch, fulfilling a request she had made years earlier. The marker read, "Clara Sutton Lawson. She healed with gentleness. Beloved wife, mother, friend." Yates visited the grave every day until his own death, 2 years later, when he was laid to rest beside her. Their children ensured that the ranch stayed in the family, honoring the legacy their parents had built through hard work and devotion. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the desert bloomed and the stars seemed close enough to touch, people claimed they could see two figures on horseback riding across the hills, a man and a woman with a black horse running beside them. It was probably just tricks of light and shadow, the mind seeing what the heart wished were true. But those who knew the story of Clara and Yates preferred to believe it was them, together still, riding through the land they had loved and the life they had built. In the town of Tonopah Junction, which had grown into a small city but still maintained its frontier character, Clara's techniques for gentling horses became standard practice. Her articles were compiled into a book that veterinary students studied, and her name became synonymous with compassionate animal care. Yates's reputation as a fair and innovative rancher influenced generations of cattlemen who came after him. But their greatest legacy was the love story they lived, the example they set of two damaged people who found each other and built something beautiful from broken pieces. The cabin where it all began still stood, maintained by the family, as a reminder of humble beginnings and the transformative power of taking a chance. Young couples sometimes visited, hoping some of that legendary love would rub off on them. The paddock where Clara first touched Diablo became a place of pilgrimage for people who worked with traumatized animals, a place where they could stand and remember that healing was possible, that patience was powerful, that gentleness could move mountains. And deep in family archives, preserved in careful handwriting on yellowed paper, was the letter Yates had written to his brother the day after he first met Clara. It read, "I met a woman today who walked up to my meanest horse without fear and gentled him with nothing but presence and breath. I do not know what will come of it, but I think my life just changed. I think she might be the one I have been waiting for. I think I might have just met my future." He had been right. That frightened horse had led him to Clara, and Clara had led him to a life richer and fuller than he ever could have imagined. They had loved deeply, lived fully, and left the world better than they found it. Their story became legend, told and retold around campfires and dinner tables, changing in small details but never in essence. The essence was this: love requires courage, healing requires patience, and the greatest rewards come to those willing to be vulnerable. A rare ability to calm frightened animals had brought two lonely people together. Their willingness to trust, despite past pain and present fear, had built a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. And somewhere in the Nevada desert, under endless stars and purple mountains, that love lived on, eternal as the landscape, enduring as the human need for connection, and beautiful beyond measure. The end of their story was really just the beginning of their legacy, rippling outward through children and grandchildren and everyone whose life they touched. Clara's gift for gentling animals became a metaphor for how all of us might approach each other with more patience and compassion. Yates's stubborn refusal to give up on damaged things became an inspiration to see beyond surface problems to the potential underneath. Together, they demonstrated that broken things could be mended, that scared things could learn to trust, and that love was the strongest force in the universe when given freely and received with an open heart. Theirs was a fast-paced, heartfelt love story set in the Wild West, where the ability to calm frightened animals was rare, where a cowboy brought his most scared horse to a woman who could help, and where that simple act of hope became the foundation for a lifetime of love and partnership. It was a story of the American frontier, of tough people in hard country making lives that mattered. It was a story of second chances and healing and the courage it takes to open your heart after loss. Most of all, it was a story of love, the kind of love that transforms everything it touches, the kind of love that builds homes and families and legacies that endure long after the original lovers have passed into memory and legend. And so the story ends where it began, with a frightened animal and the rare gift to calm it, with a desperate cowboy seeking help, with two people finding each other against impossible odds. They lived, they loved, they built something beautiful together. They left the world richer for their presence and their example. They proved that even in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the Nevada desert, love could bloom and thrive and last forever. The desert remembers. The mountains remember. The stars that witnessed their first meeting still shine down on the land they worked and the home they built. And somewhere in the collective memory of those who heard their story and were changed by it, Clara and Yates live on, forever young, forever in love, forever riding across purple hills toward a horizon full of promise and hope and infinite possibility. Their story is finished, but its impact continues, touching lives they never knew, inspiring people they never met, reminding generation after generation that love is worth the risk, that gentleness is strength, that patience can heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the most frightened animals and the most guarded hearts just need someone willing to stand close, breathe slowly, and wait with quiet faith for trust to bloom.